Okay. Unmute, Paul.
Paul, you're still muted.
Well, people don't really need to hear me mumbling as long as I'm trying to get the share screen to work. I've done this enough times and it seems like I don't know how to do it by now. But perchance, we've got the little button in it. Well,
We see a bunch of artifacts, maybe?
well, these are artifacts from Hans Mill. I'm working on the Hans Mill book, and these are some of the lavender artifacts on the transfer printed wares that are coming off that site. So rather fascinating, but unfortunately, that's not the one that I wanted to share with you. So let me try again.
I've seen one like that the last time I helped with the dishes.
All right, let's see if I can get Jerry Grover to come up. This time we have share screen, share again. We're back to artifacts, or we get Jerry Grover this time?
You got Jerry up. Good job.
Right, I'm not totally inept, just largely. All right, let's get that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. You know this is Halloween and a little bit of a strange time for some of us to have kids knocking on the door, or spooks and other strange creatures. On the other hand, you're in Central Time, it's 8 o'clock, and so I've turned the light off, anticipating that there not be any more knocking on our door this evening. And if they do, then probably tough. So I may get the tricks. But the real trick tonight is that we get to enjoy a presentation from our friend Jerry Grover. About a year ago in October, he got to give his first presentation, and he for publications that are available on the Book of Mormon Central website, in the Characters Document. It particularly would apply to for his geology on the Book of Mormon. So our presentation on Ziph. We'll look at magic the spirit religion and the travel path of the Jaredites, evidence of the Nehor religion in Mesoamerica, and the major work, which is the Swords of Shul. All of them are available for download at no cost. And Jerry has also sponsored and published the remarkable linguistic work by Brian Stubbs in relating the Semitic cognates to those of the Uto-Aztecan family. And so he is a significant contributor to Book of Mormon studies. I'm delighted that he's become available. He's participating with us with regularity, with insightful comments and questions, stepping in to fill opportunities. Well, and he's doing it again next week. And so the fact is that last year in October, he got to give his first presentation, and now here he gets two more this time, beginning in October. I really am pleased because I think that people have been inspired, informed, and it's been an intriguing experience to learn from him. His presentation first was on the illumination of a day and a night and a day in the role of the volcanoes in the Book of Mormon. And tonight he's going to be addressing us the Nephite numbers and intervals. And so if you would join me in prayer, we'll get that part introduced, invite good spirit to join us, and hopefully I can get that signed word. Let us pray together. Great One, the singular wholeness, the complete integer, the definitive creator of all that exists. We greet you this evening with many questions, the hows and the whys, our wrinkled brows and frustrated cries, inquiries about who and whose we are. These inquiries persist. And as we look to scripture, stories of the human experience, so much dysfunctionality in our past, we recognize you are the answer. Oneness with you and each other, completing your purpose in us, provides the definitive creation that lasts. So we ask that you abide with us today. Help us be in tune with what you would have us say. Bless our presenter, Jerry Grover, and may truths of his lesson glisten as we carefully listen, attempting to feel your spirit, which we invite to hover. For remembering the day of the dead, the spirit world intrepid, we would reach beyond the present scene to glance at our ghostly past, look toward a future vast, and appreciate that we're not stuck in Halloween. For you have been kind enough to impress us with grace, to embrace our own goals, and to provide a path well beyond the well-deserved wrath, to redeem and bless our unworthy souls. For our senseless violence and wars, somehow in the DNA of our cores, bubbles up, our dysfunctionality persists. Yet you, in wisdom and grace, prepare an eternal place where anything good we can be will continue to exist. And we thank you in the name of Jesus, the Christ, who came in the midst of our great interval of time. Amen. All right, if I get the stop share here, then we should be able to turn it over to Jerry Grover. And we'll invite you to listen to what he has to say, save your questions or put them in the chats. And we'll have plenty of opportunity to have question and answers afterwards. Jerry, thank you. And the rest of you, thank you for sharing. So if you happen to be somebody new, if you'd like to contact Robert Cook and get your name on the list, you're very welcome. And he sends out the invitations every week, let people know what's going on. Greg Over, thank you for taking over.
Good. And everybody, I tried share screen. Does everybody see that?
Yep, translation of the characters document.
Yep, that's it.
You got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for that introduction, Paul. The topic tonight comes from translation that I was able to complete on the characters document. At least part of it does. Basically, because there are actually quite a few dates or numbers in the document. So I'm just kind of giving you the basis there of that book is available for free to anybody to download. Hopefully the presentation won't be too dry. It's numbers. Of course, when I applied, before I started college, I did an aptitude test. And they told me I should be an engineer because I didn't have enough personality to be an accountant. So, so you'll have to. Hopefully, we'll do an engineering level presentation instead of an accountant one tonight. So.
And I'm not the only joker.
Well, I'm glad Monty's on. I hope the jokes are way better than mine. So he'll have to wait till after I'm done.
They just invite me in to give the sinner's point of view.
Okay. So the characters document, most of you are familiar with it, but just maybe there are people aren't. Essentially, this was a document that was handed down. That was the handwriting analysis show that it's probably John Whitmer that penned it. It's a copy of the characters from the plates that went through the David Whitmer family to the RLDS Church at the time, RLDS Church, and is currently held by the Community Church of Christ in their documents. Some people have called it the Anthon transcript, or for a lot of years it was referred to that, but it doesn't actually, I think the determination is that it's not, because the Anthon transcript was described differently with an emblem, et cetera. Talk about that. In the winter of 1827, Joseph Smith copied characters off the plate. So presumably this is a copy of that copy, possibly that was made by John Whitmer, maybe later. It's also possible it could have been off the small plates later. He did translate some of them. He said we actually have 4 that we show a translation to. That is a small script of paper from in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting, and also on a Frederick G. Williams. There's a part of a Frederick G. Williams document in his handwriting. Again, I mentioned it's John Whitmer is the handwriting, and the characters document's not the Anthon transcript. So there's also examples of the characters from what's called the newspaper broadside from the Prophet newspaper. It doesn't contain all the characters. It contains the top lines, and there is a little bit of discrepancy, but it also contains a few extra characters that are missing from the right side of the characters document. If you actually look closely at the characters document, some of it is on the right end. They've lost some little bits of paper. It's also been washed out a little bit. So I examined that, and these are the actual characters that are shown in the broadside that are kind of slightly off of the characters document. So these would be additional glyphs, which of course, if you're doing a translation, you need a complete set of glyphs in order to translate it. Ariel Crowley did research back in 1942 on the characters document, and I'm using his designation of numbers that he designated each glyph with a number. So when you actually see like a C dash number, that would be from the characters document, and then the broadside I called it different, like a B number. So these are the premises that were used in the translation. Because the orientation of the title, the assumption is the glyphs were basically copied in the same fashion they were on the plates. Joe Smith indicated that they ran from that the glyph reading was from right to left, same as Hebrew writing in general, even though they're not Hebrew. And basically, the script is most likely primarily logographic, meaning if you have an alphabet, you only get so many characters, like we have 26 letters and then some other, punctuation stuff. There's a lot of unique characters in the characters document, so that pushes you up to more of a logographic. Doesn't mean that there's not some phonetic or pronunciation related to them, but the other thing is the Book of Mormon indicates that the characters are Reformed Egyptian, so it was logical to look for an Egyptian source, which I'll show you. The numbers are all fairly straightforward from Egyptian hieratic. There was no like special knowledge, special revelation, special anything involved in the translation. I just used primary resources that are used for Egyptian translation. Kind of had a priority. There was hieratic Egyptian used in Palestine at the time Lehi departed, and they do have examples of that. And so I primarily looked at it's called basically Palestinian hieratic. The book's in German, and then there's also a large online resource called Mueller's hieratic. There is some Demotic in the characters document, maybe 10–15%. Demotic is a form of Egyptian. And let me just talk about that a little bit here. Most of you are familiar with the monumental Egyptian, like on the tombs, and has the pictures of birds and animals, temples and people. That's the monumental Egyptian, but wasn't used in the everyday business of the Egyptians on the papyri for the most part. They had a shorthand version called hieratic. It existed the same time period as the monumental Egyptian, so it goes way back. A little later, in 650 BC, in northern Egypt was developed another form of shorthand called demotic. It has a lot of similarities. Some glyphs are identical with hieratic, but it is a different form. And so it was present when Lehigh left. So my general strategy with the numbers was going through this hierarchy, saying, okay, I'm going to look for Palestinian hieratic. There may be some Mesoamerican sources. Looking for then go to the Egyptian hieratic, as opposed to like the Palestinian, which is slightly different. And then evaluate, when I identified the numbers, evaluate the sequences in the structure. It's well known. It was actually interesting because I had noticed the numbers when I had looked at the characters document. This bar, this little C92 with the line with the 4 dots, that's a known Mesoamerican number 9. So that's that doesn't really, there's no interpolation there. It's also, I did find a few Sumerian numbers. I kind of identified that later on. This actually exists in Elamite Sumerian as well. So I'm not saying that's the source of it, but so in any event, and I identified other numbers just looking at it because I kind of had a fascination with ancient number systems, kind of as an engineer. So what I'm going to show here is basically the number off the characters document, and then the associated number from the source material. The number 1, I don't really have source material. That's a well-known, in Egyptian, that's a well-known way to represent 1. There's a lot of other scripts that use that too, so it's not that unique. As I mentioned, the number 9 in the Mesoamerican number system. The number 2 is found from the Egyptian in the Demotic, and all these listed down here is just from a Demotic dictionary. It kind of shows they copied off of all the papyri, so it's kind of the different forms. And you have to remember that, you know, these kinds of things weren't standardized across Egypt in the sense that some scribal school may have written them slightly different. If you write in cursive, you know, everybody in this group, if they wrote, I give you a word to write in cursive, it's going to be different slightly, right? Because, you know, people write differently. Then you have the number 3. That's basically from hieratic and demotic. It basically is shown that way. The number 4, both from Egyptian hieratic. The number 5 is very standard Egyptian, the form in the characters document. The number 6, and again, there was actually a glyph showing on that broadside. That's why it's in black. There weren't a little bit of the problem with some of the numbers is there wasn't a ton of different examples in the source material, so some don't match perfectly, obviously. Number 7, this is one I was talking about where the glyph form doesn't match very well, but in context, I know it is the number 7. Number 10, very straightforward, both in hieratic, very standard number. 12, again, actually pretty straightforward in the glyph form, as you can see in from the Leiden papyri. Actually, that's an example. Then the number 50, and the little 3, that's hieratic and demotic, both have that. Number 1000, same demotic and hieratic. One reason there's a lot of similarities in demotic is the numbers were kind of more standardized, let's say. They used it, they didn't change it a lot based on the script. So there is a little bit of difference in demotic, but often a lot of the same. Then you have this C18, which matches number 20,000. There's also a half, the third is present. Then the ordinal number 1, meaning first, but it can also just mean 1, is that straight line. Then you had what I call variants, meaning there were things that they did with the numbers where they inserted dots. And it took me a little bit of time to figure out what was really going on in the number system with the dots. But honestly, I kind of figured it out, and then looking at Sumerian, they use a similar thing. So, but the dot basically can be either a 1 or a 10. It can also indicate that you times by 10 if it's located above. So here you have the little v with the dot under it's number 11. The upside down W, which is a 3 with a dot under it, is 13. So it's again representing a 10. The number 60 is a 6 with the dot above it. So you're basically timesing that by 10. These funky little glyphs here from the characters document, they are a little different than in the standard Egyptian, but you find them in Egyptian, just not quite with the way that they did it. And so basically you have that form, and then what you have is the tally marks are really 10s, so it's a 40, and then the dots are again 10 that they're showing underneath it. So you have a 40, and then when you add the 4 dots, it makes 80. And it is similar in form with use of dots to some archaic forms of the Egyptian hieratic. Then you also have this, the number 400, which consists of the hieratic number 4, as you can see, which even has a little dot, but they put the dot above it. So directly above it makes timesing by 100. So you actually have 10 and 100 that occur. So it's a kind of interesting, unique way for a number system, but it's not unknown that they have little, there are some number systems that have little marks above them to do that, a similar kind of function. Then you have the number for a million or multitude. You have 1/7, which I translated as a week in that context. Then there's these little filled in black square. That was kind of tricky. In the Egyptian, I didn't find it very well. In the first translation I did, it was kind of shown, maybe it was borrowed from somewhere else as a number, but actually looking at the Sumerian proto-cuneiform, shows up quite well exactly in the time frame when the Jaredites would have left. And it was a number 30, and when it's raised, it goes to 300. So again, it's getting modified based on its position, which is interesting because it says in the Book of Mormon that they had a hard time placing their words. So it may not have been just putting them in order. It may have been actually their position relative to each other. This is a Sumerian proto-cuneiform. As you can see, the form, there's a lot of different number systems in Sumerian, but this one is for dates. And as you can see, they put a dot inside of the day number, and it goes to 10 days. A dot inside of the other goes to 10 months. So they're actually, like I said, they're using the dot as a 10 in their system. So it has some similarities to what I call the Nephite system. It also has a shell concept, like I say, where that you put it inside and it changes, the dot changes the number. These are the proto-cuneiform bar and dot tally system that I show that actually has similarities to that number 9. These would be ones that are primarily numbers from Mesoamerica, not really Egyptian. And as I pointed out, this number 20, there's a shell glyph in the Maya that is similar to this. Epi-Olmec has a form. It's not really this exact. They haven't really translated. They do think it means month, which is kind of equivalent to a number. And also they use the number for month in the Maya, they use a 20, so it's consistent. There's also a rebus form for the number 9 here, where you have your 9 dashes above the plate there, which I'm going to talk about above the line. And then this bar dot, the interesting thing about the bar dot in Mesoamerica, it's not a Maya form at all. It's Teotihuacano or Isthmus of Tehuantepec system, where the dots are below the bar, not in Maya, they're above the bar. So it kind of tells us actually probably the location of the Nephites as well. The number 400 is also found, that form as the Mesoamerican year sign, where you have that V with a dot in the middle, dot above. And they're all kind of different forms, artistic forms of it. it also, the reason it's a year sign is because the early calendar, they think they haven't really found evidence, but they're almost sure they had a 400-day calendar. So it actually is consistent with that. One of the first number sequences I worked out was the death date of King Benjamin. Now, the number systems for Hebrew and also Egyptian are cumulative additive, which is kind of a boring, weird word, but it just basically means that you take each of the numbers and add them up. So it's not like we have where you have, you know, the number 120, it's 120, and that system, that would be 3. So it's more like a Roman numeral system where you're taking different numbers and adding them up to get a total. So they don't have like different places for the hundreds, different places for the thousands. And so if looking at the characters document, I've kind of identified the blue is the number or numerical date sequences. There are some other markers and things that we'll talk about next time, scheduled to talk next week, because what I found is around the numbers were some interesting consistent glyphs that were adjacent to the numbers. And they look, some of them I looked from, I was like, I know I've seen this somewhere. And then kind of interestingly, I was just looking at the Maya date marker system. They have 80 anterior date indicators, posterior date indicators, and these are infixed glyphs in the Maya glyphs. You can actually see the characters glyphs in the Maya. And so it's quite interesting that there was some borrowing or loaning going on there. And also these glyphs, these ADI and PDI, these are what Mayanists have translated as it came to pass. So actually, you know, it's consistent with the Book of Mormon text. That's for another day. The interesting thing is, as I did the number, I figured them all out. They were it was kind of strange because they were adding for like the number 53, it was like a 40 and the 13. I was like, this is a strange form. Why would they do it this way? There were other ones that seemed a little bit strange. And they were also had a lot of the dates had a 10 or a 5 or 5 and a 10 together, which and they were leading the rest of the numbers. The numbers generally go from largest to smallest in the order, you know, going from right to left. But they were putting this 15, a 10 and a 5, or even a 10 by itself. Of course, they had to make it add up correctly to the right date. But in the Maya, they actually have these leading 10 or 15s in their spoken number system, not really in the glyphic form. So I do find it also as a Mesoamerican function. But the other thing is, as I was noting, both 5 and 10 are sacred numbers in Hebrew. And as I looked at all the number system, they're preferentially using the sacred numbers of both the Hebrew and Mesoamerican sacred numbers. 5, 7, 10, 13, 19, and 20. 9 is also a religious number, but not necessarily sacred. It delineates death. There's 9 gods of the underworld. And you actually see that in the Book of Mormon, just straightforward, because you have like the 9 moons, the Coriantumr was with the people of Mulek, and then he died. You have Nephi, the prophet prior to for the third Nephi prophet, his father disappeared 9 years, then he was pronounced dead, if you will. And then the deaths of the disciples, Christ told them when they're going to die, 72 years, it's a multiple of 9. So you're actually seeing some numbers directly in the Book of Mormon that correlate, that they were using these in an interesting fashion. The number 24, I don't list that here or talk about it, but that was another that looks to be a founding and also a destruction or death number, because you have 24 gold plates of for the Jaredites, that Ether had, basically the destruction. The start of the Jaredites, it was Jared, his brother, and 22 friends, so they had 24 families. First king, Riha, had 24 sons. And then also even the final battle, you had 23 battle groups, and one other one probably where the survivors fled to the south. And then as you notice, Mormon said just the day before they had 24 people left before the last, they were down to 24. So that number also, and that's also 72 is a multiple of 24. So another death implication in the disciples. So this is the translation, full translation of the Characters document. I won't go through that, just so you know it does make sense and the dates match. And so you have the first 3 lines, or the first 4 lines are different. There is something structurally different. Looks like it's maybe the preface to the book of Mosiah. The second set of lines, which are smaller, that I've called basically a synopsis of the prophetic calendar. And so this would be a summary of the number sequences. You can see that you have all of these numbers identified, and then as you add them up, they equal a particular number. So there is something also that's very interesting about the Nephite number system, is that certain glyphs of the numbers also represent words. So you have like in the date for the destruction when Christ came, the little 11 has doesn't have a dot. It has like a little X little thing, and that glyph, it actually Egyptian means darkness and destruction. And then for the 34th year when Christ appeared and then ascended, that the 19 has its tail cut off. There's a little tail that gets cut off. That's down here on the bottom corner. There's normally a tail, but that glyph with the tail cut off also means God of the sun, or the sun god, So there's some interesting things going on with the numbers that they're modifying them or structuring them in a religious way. Of course, we know this is Mormon's divinatory text, if you will, his codex, the Mesoamerican codex. You would expect that it's very religious. Even the language itself is very religious. So I kind of identified that you have something going on with the numbers preferring these sacred numbers. And also these sacred numbers are mostly all related, except for the Hebrew ones that were also in the Bible. You have 7 and 10 represented in the Bible in various fashions, the Old Testament. The 10 commandments. There's Solomon's temple has a multitude of 10s, listed 10 pillars, 10 this type of thing. So it's not a new thing. This is a Hebrew practice, if you will, of having sacred numbers and using them in their texts. In Mesoamerica, the Mayans, the interesting thing is in their divinatory texts, that basically the first pages, like in the Dresden Codex, they go through all of these interesting interval placing the dates so that the intervals are sacred numbers, meaning that the period of time between the dates are sacred numbers or multiples of sacred numbers. And so I found that interesting. So I thought, I wonder if in the Book of Mormon, we do have these sacred numbers represented in the year counts, for example. And so, and it always puzzled me, 4th Nephi, because the year counts there, not only in 4th Nephi, but they have like the 51st year, the 50, they aren't these normal intervals, and there's nothing happening. So he's just listing these years. It's like, that's kind of curious. Why is he doing that? Especially where you have the plates being spaced at a premium. Why would you be listing years where nothing is happening? And it not only happens there, it also happens in Alma and a few places. And in Alma, it looks like every year under the reign of the judges this year, but there are certain gaps where he skipped 3 years. The events happened, but he just didn't identify the year. And I kind of figured out that that's because all of this, the whole Book of Mormon year count structure is based on sacred numbers. So this is the 4th Nephi verses that relate to those years. And so what I did is I said, okay, I'm going to just lay them out on a basically just a straight line graph. And so each of these dots is the years identified in 4th Nephi in that stretch. And you actually find intervals of all the sacred numbers, and sometimes multiple, within that number sequence. So the little arrows are kind of showing that the interval that matches that. So you have it in the 20. 30 is also a sacred number, interestingly enough, in Mesopotamia and Sumeria, and it also relates to the moon. All of these in Mesoamerica relate to the moon. The number 19 is actually called the Metonic cycle because it's, if you have lunar years and solar years, every 19 years they perfectly line up or inconsistent with each other. So it's called, this was discovered, it's called Metonic because it was discovered by a Greek guy. So anyway, you can see these intervals. Now, the other interesting thing is I took the year dates themselves, kind of applying just this sacred number rule. Each of the years all contain 19 as a summon, meaning you can use 19 to add up, and they all can be created from the sacred numbers by adding them. So kind of fascinating. So like, for example, 39 is 19 or 20, or it could be 19 plus 13 plus 7. So each of those years that's identified in 4th Nephi has that. You can form them, at least some multiple, right? You can at least do one that uses the sacred numbers to add up to them. So it's really complex what's going on here. They're actually using numbers that can be created from the sacred numbers, and then putting them and using them that have intervals between them of the sacred numbers. So it's actually quite a sophisticated document. The Book of Mormon is very sophisticated from a numerical standpoint. Anyway, that kind of sums up the first part where we talked about the numbers. I know that was maybe a lot to go through, and especially the Characters document is well, one thing that was interesting is there was an Egyptologist looked at this. Actually, the president of the RLS Church at the time in the 50s sent out the Characters document to different Egyptologists to see if they could make anything of it. And one of them came back and said he goes, I can see some number sequences in hieratic, which I wasn't even aware of that statement when I was doing the research, but I found the same thing. And then Ariel Crowley also identified numbers, but he was going under the premise that the Characters document was just Hebrew written with Egyptian glyphs, which really would make no sense because it would actually take you more space than it would if you just use Hebrew. So he also identified numbers, but he said, yeah, he goes, there are a lot of numbers here. So it kind of seemed like a tabulation. If you were to think it was an Egyptian, it'd be some sort of tabulation. But in fact, they are dates, and all the dates match and correlate perfectly with the Book of Mormon text, and give us some fascinating insight, because actually the date for the destruction, the 3rd Nephi destruction, was given in the reign of the judges calendar, not in the coming of Christ calendar. I mean, it was changed right after 9 years after Christ was born. So they're actually running multiple calendars. It was kind of fascinating. And so that actually ended up being the New Year's Day of the reign of judges calendar. So anyway, so open it up for questions.
Wow, unfortunately, I come when I get the first question, and I'm ready, but let me first of all express my appreciation for the numerological examination that you've made here, because it's just a bit overwhelming for those of us that are not oriented quite that way. I'd like to have you explain the concept of sacred numbers by showing us the sacred numbers that we use in the United States.
I don't know that they're, I mean, we don't really have a religious culture, to be honest with you, in terms of, but again, anybody that's Christian is familiar, with what you call the Hebrew sacred numbers. I don't know that there's really anything that I would call sacred in the United States. I mean, we have, dates like the 1776, those kinds of things that have meaning, but
Let me propose, I submit to you that the number 3 is a sacred number in our culture. We teach our kids the ABCs. We watch CBS. We eat with a knife, fork, and spoon. We recognize our children with 3 names. Why? There's no necessary requirement for that, but we go to the wishing well and we get 3 wishes. We tell all kinds of our mythical stories about the 3 pigs, the 3 bears, the 3 blind mice. And so the number 3 is highly significant, to the point that it has, I think, profoundly influenced our imagery of the divine. So we see Father, Son, and Holy Ghost as God, and try to figure out how Trinity is equal to 1. And that's a bit of a problem for us, but because it's magical and religious and powerful, then therefore I would submit to you that it is, well, and notice it's the fundamental divisor for all of our time measures, the hours and minutes and seconds and so forth. And it also has strong corollaries with baseball, and it also works out nicely with apple pie. So I would submit to you that 3 is a good example of a religious number in American culture.
it might be right. Probably there's some counter arguments like IRS. It's a 3-letter word. But yeah, I mean, there are numbers that are probably preferentially used. Sacred to everybody, I don't know, but clearly, the Trinity, is obviously a 3 number. So yeah.
Okay, let's open it up for people. The reactions button down at the bottom has the little hand to raise. If you raise your hand, then that makes it so Deb or whoever is monitoring can try to help keep track. If you can't find that reaction button and want to just simply wave your hand and be that way, then she's pretty good about following that and keeping people in some kind of sequence.
Okay, we got quite a few folks with their hands raised already. James Lucas and then Val Larson. Go ahead, James.
Thank you. Jerry, did you have a slide that showed a translation or attempted translation of the characters document? I thought I saw
there's
that.
2 of them.
Flip back to that.
Yeah. By the way, I stopped on this page here. Just if you notice the 3rd one down on the left, that number 9, that one that has the line with all the little dashes on it, and it has a 10 and a 5. That's actually the glyph for the 24 plates. So it's actually a rebus kind of interesting form. So they're using sacred numbers, and it's using 24, and the 20, like I said, 24 plates in itself is sacred. But let me go back and see if I can. So this would be the second. I mean, there's 2 kind of sections of the characters document. So this would be the first 4 lines. If you look at the characters document, you can tell the difference. I mean, there's it kind of goes down and ends, and then also the last 3 lines are written much smaller. So it seems to be, there's actually what you call looking just at the document, at the script. You would call it, there's an expectation that there may be some difference there, maybe a different section or something. Some people have said, well, Moroni wrote that and Mormon wrote the first. I mean, I don't know that for sure. Maybe possible. But. So this is a translation of the first 4 lines. And the fascinating thing is when I get into this, it's not structured, meaning any translation, of course, you're going to have to, putting it into English, especially from Egyptian, you're not gonna be able to translate it word for word, right? You just have gibberish.
Sure.
But what complicates this much more is that they are using the Mesoamerican date structure, which basically has a what you call a distance number. So there'll be a number as a base date, Then they will go forwards or backwards from that date, counting so many years forward, so many years back. And that's why they have these other little glyphs in the Maya that tell them which direction they're going. So there's an anterior date indicator and a posterior date indicator. So you go from that back. And so that is actually how the characters document is structured and has the distance number. And I'll get into that next week. But that's why I had to it does not follow the structure that we have, because we have just a chronological flow, first thing, second thing, third thing when we write. Maya don't write that. And so you kind of have to go through that and then put the structure of what it's saying into a chronological sequence. Interesting thing, there's really only one other culture that does it similar to the Maya, and that's the Sumerians. So it's kind of funny, interesting.
Okay. Okay. That's a few quick questions then. Based on what you just said, does the Egyptian or the Hebrew have that characteristic? Or do you have to jump back to the Sumerians to find an old world equivalent?
Yeah, and it's not really even that equivalent in Sumerian. I mean, they just don't use the straight chronological like we do. They do jump, but doesn't have the glyph indicators like the Maya. So it is a very Mesoamerican structure, is what I'm saying. I know that bothers people that are heartland, but that's what it is. And the glyphs, next week you'll see the glyphs for the anterior and posterior date indicators in the characters documents are in glyphs, in fixes in the Maya glyph, the exact glyph, and even are phonetically linked through, kind of showing through Brian stuff. So it's a very complex coordination, if you will, or at least correlation with the Maya. Now, it does not. I don't propose that the Maya is from Reformed Egyptian. It's not. It's loaned in, and only in the calendrical. And there is some Hebrew also in there. There was a Mayanist, David Kelly, who actually identified that 3 of the day names in the Maya day names correlate with the Hebrew day names in the same sequence, same meaning. Mulek is one, ironically, Mulek. So you have some correlation of some people in Mesoamerica. There's also been another scholar that's indicated, kind of shown correlation with Egyptian and the day names, basically the Egyptian phonetic meanings because Egyptian does have some glyphs for phonetics, meaning if they get a name that's not Egyptian, they will use these glyphs to actually see how you can pronounce it, transliterate it, if that makes sense. Anyway, he's looked at those and correlated the meanings of those, so that it's not that the Maya language and the Egyptian are the same, but the meanings of the day names and those phonetic glyphs in the Egyptian match or pretty close. So what you're looking at is some sort of a loaning in of maybe the early calendar structure, not of the full language. See, Brian Stubbs has found actually Nahuatl, the Uto-Aztecan language family, actually does have the phonetic correlations, right, with the Hebrew and the Egyptian. So that's where you're seeing it in that language family, not the Maya. The Maya is a totally different language family. But the interesting thing is they do find some Nahuatl or Uto-Aztecan borrowed into the very early Maya because they were adjacent. And actually, that's what I'm seeing is some of what the terms Brian has identified, that actual glyph form, meaning I find all of these calendrical markers in Egyptian. So they are there and have meaning, basically date meanings or calendrical meanings in the Egyptian. And where they are borrowed into the Mayan, actually the phonetics from the Hebrew or the Uto-Aztecan are coming in. So we haven't completely obviously figured it out. It was hard enough to just do the translation here, to go through and kind of figure it out. But it's the translation I've rendered is, the complexity of the number system and having it be able to all those add up and match the dates in the Book of Mormon with all of the surrounding text being the same and identifying it. I think it's pretty convincing that the translation is pretty much correct. And I've also gone through all of the glyphs in the characters document that I use, the hieratic, and dated them to their, basically looking at the Egyptian source material. And most of them are pre-Lehi departure. So actually the glyph forms match the hieratic glyph forms that are found in the characters document actually match the glyph forms you would expect from the time frame previous. Some are early, very early, but I expect that's kind of brass plate stuff. Maybe they're on the brass plates with a, an older form of Egyptian hieratic.
Sure. So I see people are in line here, but to jump, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but to jump to my other main question, which is, where do you think, so, assuming that the characters document was in fact copied from something that Joseph Smith copied from the actual plates, would you then reason that what you've translated here, that these characters are from the lost pages rather than from the Book of Mormon we have? Because just reading it, it looks like it's talking about material that might have been in the Book of Mosiah from before that were in the lost pages. Yeah.
And so again, only because we have a section, I wish I had the plates, right? That'd be great. I could tell you right where they're at. But so far, nobody's decided to, appear and give them to me.
Right.
But it's so the first part, I would say, just like you said, it seems to have the elements of all the other prefaces, meaning if you look at all the other prefaces of the other books, and of course, Mosiah is missing a preface because it was in the 116 pages.
Right.
So that's an actual good candidate. I also think it's possible that there may have been and maybe that also explains the second portion, that there may have been a large preface at the beginning of the Book of Mormon that was part of the 116 pages that was lost. There's also another for the second portion of it, which is basically a summary of the prophetic calendar. There's also a possibility, and again, this is kind of my own proposal, or I'm not saying it for sure, but I'm saying that it needs to be considered. And that is that when you had, in the words of Mormon, which has always been kind of this big debate as to, okay, how did Mormon, how did he know to end it, right when where the 116 pages were lost, right? That's kind of prophetic. I actually think it's possible that there was more text. They only translated, and it may have been on the small plates where he did some writing on words of Mormon were maybe on the small plates, probably were, because we know that Omni says all the plates were full, so he would have had to add an additional plate and add to it that you actually had more information that Mormon had written on the small plates, but Joseph Smith, they only translated up to the point that was needed to have it dovetail with, the chapter in Mosiah where they started again. Does that make sense? So I think that's a possibility.
Right. Of course, another speculation is that the last part of the Words of Mormon is simply a piece of the original Book of Mosiah from the lost plates, and the first part is so the actual Words of Mormon sort of commentary is just verses 1 through 11 in the way we have the LDS versification, and at 12 through 13 was it 16 or whatever, 17 is actually material from that they remembered or carried over from the last part of the Book of Mosiah that they of the lost pages. But anyway, that's sort of to the side.
I do discuss that in the book. I do discuss that in the book. Maybe kind of just, again, these are possibilities. I don't.
Right.
But it's clear it's not something we have now. These characters are not in the Book of Mormon.
Right. Is this translation here discussed and explained in your book?
Yeah, I go through every single glyph and go into great detail, and it's just it's very fascinating as you go. That there's actually is hieratic now. As you know, Mary Jo Jackal and Faye Shaw, they published a book after me where they did a translation or attempted some portion of translation looking at this. The interesting thing is that she was going strictly off demotic. So she's really looking at the demotic. And then she tried to like say, okay, I found some straightforward glyphs in demotic, and then tried to like formulate the others with the phonetic method. But actually interesting, essentially a lot of the demotic that she found, I had also found in the same glyph. So I do think that is a useful research that she did. But she was looking exclusively in demotic, not really hieratic. So it ended up being mostly hieratic with some demotic in it.
Okay, I'll pass to other folks. Very interesting.
Thanks, James. Val and then Rick. Go ahead, Val.
Okay, really interesting stuff. Just as an aside, based on some other things you were talking about, there is an interesting article in the Interpreter where the argument was that Words of Mormon was incorporated in the Book of Mosiah, and there's something in the Doctrine and Covenants that indicates that when they sent off the 116 pages, they had an incomplete, they were doing them in these little booklet type things, and they had one of them that was incomplete, and it said something about the retained portion. And the reason it's kind of a powerful thing is if they had the Words of Mormon at the time they lost the 116 pages, you can understand how that would be a tremendous testimony to everybody that's left, that it had Words of Mormon, which was accounting for the fact that those plates were going to be, or that translation was going to be lost right at the moment, providentially, that just before it was lost. And because otherwise you'd expect them to be a little skeptical about his inability to translate again. But if they had Words of Mormon, it would explain that this was all set up by the Lord. That's kind of an aside. My question about your work here, which I really appreciate and I'm interested in, is when you were doing your presentation, you talked about the numbers. And so you've got a lot of numbers in this passage. Are the numbers the part that you translated, and the rest is interpolation based on other things you know from the Book of Mormon, or do you actually have?
No, I translate all the words, all the.
Everything.
Yeah, the text is there. I just picked out the numbers to discuss the numbers, but
Oh,
there's
okay.
The book has a full translation of.
All right, well, this is quite the thing to.
Yeah, and the names are, I mean, some of them are fascinating. Like if you go to like in the, let's see if I can get there. Well, actually, yeah. So if you probably can't see can you see my pointer? Is that visible or no? Probably not.
Yeah.
It is?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So like the word for Nephi is kind of just fascinating because you actually have, and this was this glyph for tribe is a straightforward Egyptian glyph for tribe. This glyph is a glyph for son, S-O-N. But if it's also the glyph for tribe is the same glyph in Egyptian as beautiful or Nefer, which is Nephi's name. And so I do think Mosiah actually flipped it when he said that they're children of Christ, gives you a new name, the right, and Benjamin is a right and left, says on your right hand. And so it looks like he actually maybe modified the glyph name for Nephi. The other thing that's interesting is the name. There's another Nephi name. They don't use the same glyph for the different Nephis, which actually makes sense if you look at the original text of the Book of Mormon, because none of the books of Nephi had 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 on them. Those were just added afterward. They were just Book of Nephi, Book of Nephi, Book of Nephi, Book of Nephi. I think what's happening is you had a glyph form that's different for the name, just like, my name's Jerry, but you can also write Geri. So have the same name, but have different, spelling. I think they had different glyph forms for each of those Nephis. Something also, kind of fascinating from the characters.
Well, it's really an incredible piece of work that if you're able to persuasively extract something from this, which would seem to be an Achilles heel, you've turned a weakness into a great strength.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as I started the research, I actually just ran into this because I was doing the book on Zith. And I calculated the number of plates, you know, based on the weight and everything. So I said, okay, well, let's see if the Book of Mormon can actually fit on those number of plates. And I was just going to take it and say, okay, if it's a logographic language, you'd expect so many words per glyph or a syllabic language. And that's where I noticed, oh, there's a bar.9, you know, and of course, you know, I knew enough to say that's a bar.9. I know those were Egyptian 5 and 10, because that was the first one I looked at. And then in the Egyptian, these ones were like ascend to the eternal land. So I'm obviously looking at a death date of some sort. And then it's predated by this is a data indicator that's found in the Maya glyphs. So it was pretty clear that, and the complexity of it, meaning you could never get these dates to add up like that if it was some mumbo jumbo type of translation. So anyway, yeah, I had it reviewed by an Egyptologist. He said, actually, all of your, you know, your hieratic that's correct from the source material. He wouldn't say, I can't tell you that's the translation. He didn't want to go that far. Of course, he was a believing one. So, but I've had it out for the translation. The first translation substantially is the same as what I updated, but there were just a few glyph forms that I'd found in like the Sumerian and all that kind of thing. It's been out since what, 2016, and so far nobody's refuted anything on it. So,
Well, I'll yield to Rick for his question.
Okay.
so Rick, are you up?
Yeah, I heard Dad's voice, but it kind of went oink, 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 and I wasn't sure if that was a go ahead, Rick. Thanks for presenting. That's fascinating. I don't know how you get all of it done.
I have restless leg syndrome, so I only sleep 3 hours a night.
Be like restless mind syndrome. Okay, well, thanks a lot for sharing that with us. My question is, this collection of characters that were copied down, were they in any particular place of the Book of Mormon? Do you know? I mean, were they, you know, if the Book of Mormon was arranged Hebraically, then it would have been, you know, on the right side, you know, on the right cover or somewhere like an intro. Do you know where these characters were copied from?
Well, no, they
And
don't.
what, yeah,
Yeah,
and what purpose they were supposed to serve.
I think it was described that there was writing on both sides of the plates, meaning so that there wasn't like an empty side. So they utilized all the space, right?
Yeah,
And then
even
it
the
did-
edges.
Right. And and it did say that, you know, that like the title page was the last page. I mean, he mentioned that is the last page. So, and that was written by Moroni, I'm pretty sure. But
Yeah.
So the question is, where did this come from? I mean, the interesting thing is, I would guess that, and we don't know, this may, like I said, we know Joseph Smith copied some characters off, but it's in John Whitmer's handwriting. So maybe it's a copy of a copy, and the broadside has copy. But the last one, the last 3 lines may have been small plates because it's a different, and so John Whitmer may have actually seen the plates, you know, enough to copy them. I don't know, you know, I mean, he was
Yeah.
there, so it's in his handwriting. Again, I don't have, you know, there's really no information. What I would say is it's clearly not on the Book of Mormon that we have now. So it could be, yeah, it's not part of the Book of Mormon, but it's consistent with, like we mentioned, maybe the preface to Mosiah, the Book of Mosiah, the first part.
Okay.
It may be part of a larger preface that the Book of Mormon had. I don't know. I mean, that's just conjecture, right? And,
Okay. Do the top one, two, three, four lines, they're bigger, and then you said the next 3 lines are a little smaller.
right.
Do the big lines flow linguistically into the little lines? I mean,
No.
like, are they continuation, or does it kind of interrupt and start something new?
It's a total break. Yeah. So you
Okay.
start the third line up, like those first is basically talking the 5-year prophecy before Samuel the Lamanite. So it kind of just jumps there. And this is all the date here in the top is all linked to basically the death of Benjamin. And so then it goes back and forth, correlating. So with his death date. So I do think there's no real relation, and actually the flow is different, meaning it's more of a text on the top or the bottom. You can actually see structurally they're on the bottom 3 lines. There are these little dashes, you know, that are occurring. And in Egyptian, those are breaks like in a tabulation. So it's clear it's kind of an interesting thing is that's the only punctuation mark that's ever been identified in the Book of Mormon in the original text, as a dash in a preface.
Do you think that those 2 sections were copied from different places in the plates?
Yeah, and that's why I think maybe the second portion was copied maybe off the small plates. You know, obviously, you know, they weren't. Joseph wasn't really using the small plates. We don't know where they were at in the stack. Some people say they were separately brought by, you know, Nephi, you know, from Hilkamora. I don't know. So we don't have any like real definitive.
Okay. All right. Lastly, if I understood correctly, you said that the number 19 had some relation to the moon.
Well, yeah, lunar year cycles. That one.
Oh, okay.
Because that's called the Metonic cycle. So you have 19 solar years line up with how many? The lunar year is a different length, but every 19 solar years they correlate and come back into alignment.
Okay.
And that's in Mesoamerica, that's a recognized kind of one of their. Of course, they were calendar fixated, right? So everything they did had
wheels within wheels.
Yeah, and actually, that's the interesting thing is I do think that's why it's showing. That's what we would expect from Mormon's codex, right? Is that it still has a Mesoamerican influence, not necessarily from the religion, but at least the calendar count. And if you look at the Book of Mormon, it's counting years, and so and kind of interestingly, if you actually look at the number of chapters in each book from the original text, it also matches these sacred numbers. I actually have a little paper on that. So even the chapter structure in the Book of Mormon matches.
Okay. Wow. Okay, so 19 solar years equals something lunar years.
Yeah, I'd have to look. I should know that off the top of my head.
That's okay. You can if you discover that next week, you can share it.
Let's see.
I was on the topic with another presenter about what calendar they were using during Book of Mormon days. And
yeah, I have a whole book coming out on that, a huge one on the Book of Mormon chronology. So if you got any questions, Eric,
a huge one. Okay, I'll open up a thumb drive.
Yeah, it's like 500 pages. I don't know if that's huge, but
well, yeah,
a lot of this is in here. I talk about the numbers too, but
all right.
Yeah, it looks like basically they're using the lunar year down until meaning they were running multiple calendars.
Right.
The Nephites were just like the rest of Mesoamerica people did. And
okay.
But they shifted to the solar calendar retroactively 9 years after Christ was born. They still ran the lunar calendar. In fact, that's the only way that the prophecies actually work. Because because you have Samuel Lamanite making his prophecy 5 years before Christ was born, but he also had a 400-year prophecy, right? That the sword of justice would fall on the Nephites in 400 years. But
right.
Yeah, 384, that doesn't work. 5 years before, that's 389 years. That doesn't work on the Book of Mormon calendar. But if you know that that his prophecy was made on the lunar, uncorrected lunar calendar, 354.37 days per year, because they hadn't adopted that other calendar yet, and you run that, it matches exactly. Same thing with the Alma prophecy, where he said 4 years after Christ came in the flesh, that the Nephites would be extinct. And then you have 420 years, then Moroni buried the plates as 420 years passed. And then that one doesn't work either unless you use the lunar years. Then it works exactly.
Fascinating. So that'll be in that book, that 500-page book.
Yeah, some of it's I do talk about the calendar a bit in this book, because I lay in actually exactly how this fits in the Book of Mormon chronology, because it has actually some dates that we don't have. Talks about the 19th regnal year of Mosiah, is when it starts. So I mean, there's actually some dates that we don't have in the Book of Mormon that the Characters document tells us. The other thing I did in the book is those 4 glyphs that Joseph Smith translated. I actually show they actually translated into Egyptian exactly what he said. Book of Mormon interpreters of languages. You find them in the hieratic in that form. Mormon not, because that's a name, but you actually find that in Mesoamerica, meaning water, and anyway. So yeah, so
Okay.
I actually translate those 4 glyphs just like I did these, and it's the same.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Jerry. I'm going to yield.
Hey, thanks, Rick. Rainbow Eagle, you're next, and then Paul, and then Monty. Go ahead. You need to unmute, Rainbow Eagle, please.
Okay. Yes, it's an awesome study, Jerry. I do have a question as to the use of the word sacred. And in the studies that I've had in Judaism, and even with some rabbis, is that there is a kind of a value of historical events. It's called midrash. It's that
yeah.
which is repeated for a purpose. And I was thinking of your number system of your 19, that I'm not wanting to be a spoiler here, but it could be a visit to a significant, you said the 19 in the solar business, a visit to something that is meaningful, that is carried from the past into the present. It's kind of like that midrash system of the Jewish culture, like let's say about the Judas story, that the word betrayal really means hand over. And then you find other things that are repeated in the Old Testament, that's repeated also in the other, the handing over by a group of 12, and both stories have a betrayal. And there is a expected death for both, let's say, the Joseph, a coat of many colors, as well as Jesus, and on and on. There's a lot of examples of the Jewish system of not forgetting the past, and they do that in repeating things of numbers, and like the 40 days and 40 nights. I may be completely off base here, but is it possible that the repeating number of like the 19 is not so much sacred as it is meaningful? What do you say?
Well, yeah, I think I guess what I'm looking at it, and well, because you come from that culture, is oftentimes, they didn't, it's not like the Western where we say, okay, here's the government, here's the religion. The religion was all part of your life, right? Meaning it was events, it was your history, it was kind of enmeshed. So I think you're correct, meaning it could have the numbers repeating, could be reference to a story or particular principle, or I do see that in the little bit that we have here. For example, the number, the name for Nephi, the son of Nephi, who was there, when Christ came, his name flipped also means 3. So I do think you can't, like the 3 disciples or something like, so they've actually tried to integrate the numbers into the story. If that does that, I'm kind of stretching. I don't know that I have the data to show all of that, but I do think that what we're looking at is a very even the form of the language is religious and was based around their religious and their experience and their history.
Okay, and you see, it's the Jewish character and culture to honor the past. And the only way that you can honor the past is not forgetting it. And so they intentionally place it into the present writings, let's say. The delicacy part of that, Jerry, is that they're more concerned about honoring the idea and the repeating than whether it is true or not. The truth that is irrelevant, as it is let's remember the 40 days and 40 nights, and let's remember the Exodus and these sorts of this sort of thing. And so that's what the problem is that which we take as real may be just a way that the Jewish system operates.
Well, the interesting thing, like in the Maya, like you say, that the kings, like their birth dates and stuff,
Yep.
we think some of them are fudged, meaning they were trying to make it match a particular number, right? That was an important number, so they
That's
would
right.
fudge their birth date to give themselves more credibility. Does that make sense? More of a religious impact, I suppose. So I don't know what's going on in the original Book of Mormon plates. I would suspect that because it is done by a native cult, it's in the context of a native culture, not necessarily. Everyone always looks at it in Hebrew. I'm saying, I think the original text has a lot of influence from the native culture.
Well,
They did derive from Hebrew, but they were 1,000 years removed in this culture. So they had integrated a lot and learned a lot from the native culture that was there. Integrated a lot of their techniques, perhaps, even like, anyway, so I can't make all those proposals off of this small piece of paper.
Okay. Somebody else can talk now.
Okay, thank you. Paul and then Monty.
Thank you. I would appreciate it, Jerry, if you could show me where Sidon is in the characters. I'm intrigued because you identified Sidon with the Grijalva and also mentioned the Summa Sancta. So I'm curious about how you arrived at the Grijalva being the Sidon, and I'm interested to see where Sidon is and also where Zarahemla is in the character.
Yeah, you notice I put in parentheses the Grijalva. I mean, obviously, that's not the name then, or you see Macinta. What you have in the characters document is you have directional glyphs that use a line for the river, and they have upriver and downriver. And even the term for Lamanite has a line before the glyph and a hook above it, which is meaning the upriver tribe. You could actually interpret it as the upriver tribe. It also actually means filthy and dirty and other things. So that's a whole nother topic. That I do think that the Nephites did not like the Lamanites. Okay, and it's reflected in their glyphs. People say the racist was like, yes, actually, honestly, you would expect that in an ancient culture that was not getting along with somebody else. So you have to, when I interpolate, part of where I'm interpolating the Usimacinta and the Sidon is because part of the characters document here, especially where it's in the first part, it talks about the Limhite. Limhi left the expedition going down, getting the Jaredite plates and returning. And so it says that they're going upriver and downriver. And so the Sidon, let's see. Sidon is an interpolation of what I call the C108 and C217, because we actually do have the name Sidon is found in Egyptian, meaning it was transliterated. It was because that was a river, right, that was not too far from Egypt. And so you do find it mentioned in Egyptian, and they have kind of used a glyph form for it. And so that basically the upriver glyph also matches Sidon. So I kind of interpolated there. The Usimacinta, basically, at least in my understanding of the geographical makeup of the Book of Mormon geography is, if you read, I basically equate the Usimacinta with the line of Lamanite possessions. If you line in the Book of Mormon is a river, the line Bountiful is the Quetzalcoatlus River. And then you have the line of Lamanite possessions is the Usimacinta. And so that actually is consistent with the Egyptian. So that's where that interpolation came from. It's my interpolation. It's not, the Sidon is found. I mean, if you look at the glyph form, it does match the river Sidon as found in the Egyptian. It's C108 and C217. You know, if you want to get it, but the book, I have an explanation of that. So,
And how about Zarahemla?
Zarahemla is there on the top, top line. And it, again, that, you know, partly what you've got, all the names that you're finding in the characters document are matching metonymic, meaning they have meaning. So the Egyptian is not, it's not a phonetic representation of the name, meaning it's not Egyptian, you know, with an M sound typically. It's actually the Hebrew meaning written in Egyptian. Does that make sense? So let's see, Zarahemla is that little kind of, let's see how many characters, because I don't have the numbers up here on the, it's a little kind of, if you go over almost in the middle and you have kind of what looks like a 6 with a dash line it and almost looks like a cursive T. That equates to Zarahemla, and the meaning, let me make sure I'm correct. So it is one of the meanings that the Book of Mormon onomasticon identifies as potential meaning for Zarahemla, because they propose like 3 or 4 different ones. And let's see. So, sorry, I don't have a very good tape. Yeah, so it's those 2 glyphs, and basically the curly 6 element, and I call it the curly 6, means God, such as power of God, and the other part of it is godly offspring. And so that is one of the proposals in the onomasticon as progeny of God or godly offspring is the meaning Zarahemla. So it actually, those glyphs in Egyptian mean that.
Could you use your cursor and point to them in the characters page that's up?
Yeah, right here. So these 2 here.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to also, well, we had this discussion about calendars and you referred to numerous of them. I'm particularly intrigued that you noticed the inversion of the dots for the Maya and the Isthmus calendar or Teotihuacan calendar.
Right. Yeah, see, the bar dot system is used in Mesoamerica, but it's actually represented differently in certain cultures. So Teotihuacan had the dots on the bottom, as did the Isthmus. One of that, of course, the Teotihuacanos were down there, so maybe that's a Teotihuacan influence. That particular one I did was from Porcones, right? It's a archaeological site, kind of at the Isthmus itself. So,
I'm intrigued about the, perhaps you have more information about the excavations of the tunnel, the cave in and the tunnel under the Ciudadela.
yeah, I don't talk about that, but
Okay, well,
was there any glyph forms? I don't know if there were any.
forms, I just very much intrigued that there's I think it's about a 4-year project now, clearing out the tunnel under the that they discovered under the Ciudadela with huge numbers of sacrificial items.
Yeah, that's a whole nother, I kind of my proposal, or at least the kind of what I subscribe to is that basically Teotihuacano was the source of the Gadiantans. So,
Interesting.
yeah, the Teotihuacan, and then he did, because it matches, basically they were warrior merchants and they would, get power by getting the locals to knock off their leaders, and sometimes they would knock them off, and that kind of thing. So it's actually the MO of the Teotihuacanos pretty consistent with what we read in the Gadiantans in the Book of Mormon. And actually, I kind of point that out in another paper I did, is that even like the treaty itself that Mormon did, he did it with the Gadiantans and the Lamanites, right? And the treaty went all the way to the narrow neck, up to the narrow neck, the trade corridor, but didn't include it when he took the land, when they negotiated and said to Lamanites, you guys have the land southward, also the narrow neck. But after that, there is no discussion of battle with the Gadiantans. It's only the Lamanites. And so he didn't really breach the treaty with the Gadiantans, although they were obviously helpful and hoped they would be wiped out, because they still had, their agreement was to keep the trade corridor open. And they couldn't, that's why he couldn't go north either, because he would have broken his agreement with he'd go up into Teotihuacan, he's going to get wiped out. So it actually correlates pretty well, and that the isthmus would have Teotihuacan influence down there is not surprising. It was a major trade route. So, because that's what the Gadians did. They just wanted to control they wanted to control the governments, and they wanted to control the trade routes, but I don't think they were really interested in like dominating culture. They just want to get rich. And that's what Mormon says, and actually there is a glyph for Gadianton here, down here, Gadianton tribe. That is the Egyptian form for wealth.
Uh-huh. Well, Teotihuacan clearly was a wealthy city.
Yeah, they had different quarters for different cultures up there. It was a trade center. They had like the Mixtecs there. They had Maya there, and it's interesting because here in the very end, he uses Gadianton tribe, but that's only at the very end, which actually corresponds with what we know of Teotihuacan history, is that until Spear Thrower Owl came, the dominant one who was basically over the entrada into the Yucatan, into the Maya, where the Teotihuacanos came down and knocked off Jaguar Pa and got control and inserted their own king. Before that, there was no king. There was no real dominating. It was just a council that ruled Teotihuacan. So that's why it was like the robbers of Gadianton. He never called them. Mormon didn't call them a tribe, because they really didn't have a king. That's a thing that dictates whether there's a tribe or not, is whether there's a king. So anyway, kind of totally off base of the Characters Document here, but it actually, what I'm saying is everything that I hear in the Characters Document is consistent with the, what's found in Mesoamerica and, what you would expect.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, Jerry, we've had a request for where people go to get your books that are online. How do they get them?
Yeah, it was on the last page I didn't get to of the, well, let's see. Right there.
Okay, Rick, there you go.
Thank you. Josh Neely posted it too in the chat.
Yeah, and you could just do a search on Jerry Grover Characters, spell it without, spell it the way it is on the document. I will come up first on Google every time.
So if anybody else puts stuff in the chat, you may need to let me know, because when I went offline, I lost everything that was in my chat. So we have Monty, and then we have Josh. So go ahead, Monty.
Okay, Jerry, as I was listening to you tonight, I was just plain flabbergasted, overwhelmed with the complexity of the document and how people can think that someone back in the days of Joseph Smith Jr. would be able to handle a project like that. without the direction of God. I mean, the simple fact of finding the plates, he didn't use a divining rod, he didn't have a metal detector, and he certainly didn't have ground penetrating radar. He had the Lord directing him to the spot where they were. And when he got there, he said, dig. So, you know,
Yeah, well, and even Egyptian wasn't even basically deciphered at that time, a bit.
yeah,
Champollion
just
had done some, so it's kind of like, how could he have even copied something like this?
you know,
Have it make
anybody
any
who looks
sense?
into it any bit at all can realize that this is an impossible task for someone who was in the situation Joseph Smith was, without integral leadership from God and in the translation work and every phase of it.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, you know, I actually post a lot in ex-Mormons and, you know, the different blogs, just so people can come look at my work. I'm nice. But it was kind of funny because somebody responded and said that it doesn't mean that in Egyptian, it means this in Egyptian. And I was like, so you're admitting it's all mostly Egyptian? Yeah. So I'm kind of like, okay, don't believe my translation. I don't care. The fact that it's Egyptian is a problem for you. So
Well, I deeply appreciate your work on that and find it fascinating. On another note, Paul, tell Rena we love her and we hope she gets to feeling better.
Thank you. She does seem to be getting a little bit better. And I very much appreciate the fact that she has had the audacity to defy the doctors and come home rather than going to the hospital. So your prayers for her are very much appreciated.
Well, we're praying for you too.
Last week, the doctor told her to go to the emergency room immediately. And she reflected upon her past experience of that and told him she had suffered enough and asked me to take her home. And so that's where we are. So your
Well,
support is very much appreciated.
she's certainly in our hearts and in our prayers.
Thanks, Monty. Josh Gailey and then Rainbow Eagle. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that update about Rena, and Paul will continue to pray. But Jerry, it's wonderful to see this tonight, and I think you know how highly I regard your work that you do. The question I had was, when you began this research, how much limitation did you find with the fact that, like when you're dating back to Book of Mormon times, the Teotihuacanian language, you know, as far as I understand, hasn't been totally cracked yet. And some of like the Proto-Maya hasn't been totally cracked yet. I know the bulk of this work is in the Egyptian, but when you were initially like diving down the rabbit hole and trying to see where all this tied to, were there limitations you found in the New World based on how far back you can go with the language? Or
well, yeah, I mean, part of it, they haven't, I mean, I did in another paper I've done, there was a cylinder seal found in Chapati Corzo, which, you know, is basically Sidon, which I suppose was Egyptian. I rendered a translation of it. There's not a lot of examples of what you would call Egyptian, although there's like, you know, the Maya cartouche around, you know, the cartouches around the Maya glyphs and stuff. So it's not like, okay, we have some Egyptian form in Mesoamerica. Mostly what I was finding is there were a few glyphs. I mean, the forms, you know, kind of like epiomic. We haven't translated that, but there are kind of the form of the glyph. They thought that meant month, had some similarity. So I guess I think what I'm saying is it is Egyptian. When he says it's reformed in a couple different ways. Number one thing was kind of interesting. You know, it took me a long time because, you know, to go through all these glyphs and look at every potential hieratic glyph for each one of these is very time consuming. But what I did figure out was that they're using, because you have to go to the hieratic, and you have to, there's not like a dictionary that goes from hieratic straight to the definition. You have to go through and go to the monumental Egyptian. But what I was finding is they were using the shortest version of the word in Egyptian. So the least number of glyphs. And that's actually why what I found is when they used demotic, it was only because it was a shorter glyph form. So I do think that the medium of the plates was one of the reasons that the language was reformed. This is clearly, I don't think that the Reformed Egyptian is some kind of lingua franca. I think it is a religious text, probably just used by the priestly class, only by them perhaps. And in fact, the interesting thing is if you look at Brian Stubbs' work, most of the Egyptian terms are all kind of priestly, sacrifice or names of God, you can construct names of God. So I do think there's something going on that the Egyptian probably was mostly a kind of the Reformed Egyptian was not, you couldn't just go out and the Nephites could read it. I think it was probably limited just to this higher, the priestly class or the religious class. So that's one reason you don't see it in Mesoamerica, really. It was very a limited script, only for a certain tribe. And actually, one of the interesting things in the Characters document is it gives you the number of people that went to Zarahemla, that Mosiah took with him. It's 20,000. That's it. So there wasn't a huge, the population at that time is not very large. And they were outnumbered 2-1 by the people of Zarahemla. So really, they had their own language that was just some corrupted form of who knows what, right? Because they were just mingling with the Jaredites and the Olmecs, and the Zoke. So I guess what I'm saying is that's one reason why this text, it doesn't have a lot of what you call Mesoamerican glyph forms in it, a little bit,
Right.
but it does have a Mesoamerican structure and calendrical structure. So it does reflect the culture that's underlying it, but they aren't. And that's the other thing I found in the calendars when I work on this calendar book. I thought, I'm going to go in there and find all of these, patterns with the long count and all this stuff going on in Mesoamerica, the calendrical system of the Mayas. But the thing is that calendrical system is just a pagan religious, system that, has all the gods integrated into it. I do think the Nephites were trying to keep their own religious calendar separate from Mesoamerica. They may have used, the way they wrote their dates may have been the structure, but not, it wasn't incorporating those. It was sticking on the lunar calendar for the most part, which they had when they left. That's why it's a continuous count, from 600 years. And they made the prophecy, because they started counting when they were in the old world, not the new world. So you would not expect, that. So yes, it was interesting to see some of the correlations with the Mesoamerican structure, but it didn't. Most of it is pretty straightforward, what I call straightforward hieratic. Others may argue, but and so you can actually, like my book, you just look, there's the glyph, there's the Egyptian meaning, and here's what it is in the Characters document. It's not like, I've created this whole new system. And the number system is also just fascinating and actually go through in the book and show there's actually a lot of science into the evolution of number systems. And one thing is they don't change base. If it's a base 10, they don't change the base. Mesoamerican number systems are all base 20. So it's in a hieratic base 10, but it's got all these weird base 20 influences on it, like the number 40 and 20, right? So it's kind of interesting that the number system, again, this is all, who cares about it, right?
No, it's fascinating to me.
Yeah,
It's
I mean, it's not
incredible,
nobody's testimony is based on the number 20 or something.
Well, if I could,
But that's
if
why
I could
Paul
just
has me
follow
on.
up real quick. Sorry, go ahead.
That's why Paul has me on. Nobody cries after my presentations unless it's from boredom.
Well, if I was putting a different hat on, Jerry, with a totally different question, so like more of the apologetic question, like when you look at like Joseph Smith studying Egyptian in the 1830s or whatever, as he's in the temple and different things, like would any of these glyphs have been available to him at the time? I'm just thinking of any possible rebuttal from a critic. Like, is there some stuff that you find on the documents that would have not been available to him and clearly then been something that, based on this translation of correct, isn't something Joseph Smith could have created on the Characters document or John Whitmer on their own?
I don't think most of the hieratic. I mean, you have the Rosetta Stone, a few other things, but
hardly anything.
I haven't really looked at what he could have looked up in the Palmyra library or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Of Egyptians. Yeah, I don't. I mean,
yeah.
The answer is like Demotic and hieratic. I mean, they didn't. And I don't think, honestly, I mean, I have my differences. The facsimile translations don't really work, honestly. So they're not hieratic. Like this translation is actually very straightforward, whereas the facsimiles aren't. I mean, that does
Right.
not known hieratic. So I don't think he could read Egyptian at all without the interpreters, right? He wasn't like learning Egyptian as he went along. I do think, there's some other things like probably like the seal form was described as on the Anthon transcript. Perhaps when he saw the hypocephalus, he was like interpolating, okay, I know that kind of translated into something in the Book of Mormon, maybe, because maybe he was looking at that first page that had the seal, which I think is the seal of Moroni, really, was what you're looking at. I mean, some sort of seal. So I don't know. I mean, this is all kind of interpolation, but I do think that he maybe took some things from the Book of Mormon translation, tried to apply them, maybe sometimes incorrectly. I don't know. But when he did got the papyri from.
Yeah.
So, by the way, I'm sponsoring for
fascinating.
any that are interested or live in the area on November 12th. I'm sponsoring Royal Skousen's going to give a presentation on the current status of his work, which I'm paying for, which is talking about emendations, textual emendations of the Book of Mormon and other things. So if anybody's in the area, it's at Utah Valley University. So.
Will that be streamed, Jerry? And then I'm done. Thank you very much.
I think he's talking to Book of Mormon Central, maybe to tape it. I mean, to video it. I don't know if it's going to be streamed, but it may be recorded and then be made available. I've kind of just sponsored. I'm letting him do it. I mean, I'm just paying for it, so I'm not dictating what he. Because one thing I like about Royal Scouts, he's very independent. He doesn't really care what BYU says or what even church LDS general authorities say. Stuff. In fact, they want him to change stuff. He says, get lost. I'm doing my own work. They didn't like some of the the changes that he was saying needed to be made based on the original text.
Okay. Rainbow Eagle, Paul, and then Rick. Go ahead, Rainbow Eagle.
Okay. I would just like to place on the table another way that we can look at the concepts of a king, certainly in North America, what was translated or looked at as a chief, or certainly a leader of a tribe, or even a spokesperson of the tribe. In this moment, there were a number of tribal systems that I'd like to be able to distance, let's say, the concept of hierarchy. Certainly in Mesoamerica, Central America, there was a designation of some kind of a hierarchy, but the systems of North America was based more on what a person's gift was, what a person's vision was. And there was not a designation of a person that spoke for the person at all, as it was a person that had the gift of being able to attend meetings and come back and talk about those meetings. So Jerry, I'm just giving some comment to your idea that there's not a designation of a tribe unless there was a king. I just picked that one up. If we were to go into some of, and obviously there was diverse tribalism in North America, but certainly quite a number of those systems in North America, it was based upon more of a skill and a gift and a vision, personal vision, rather than a particular person that was speaking for or leading or being a chief of. Those concepts was needing to be developed by the company that came across the water. So I just wanted to distance a little bit the idea of the importance of hierarchy and the importance of a spokesperson that speaks for the people. That is not found in a lot of the Native American systems, as I understand it, having visited a great deal and looked into ancientness. So there you are, Jerry. I just wanted to give a little bit of comment about there certainly can be a tribe even without a designated leader.
Well, here's the interesting thing. It's actually in that characters document, that glyph, which translates as tribe, really its primary form is called phyle, P-H-Y-L-E, which is a religious group. So it kind of isn't what just what you're saying, you know, what all the people, the Westerners call a tribe. Yes, it was a group of people, but it was more something in common. And maybe the leader was a spiritual leader, basically selected because of his gifts, right? And not necessarily from.
There again, you get into the selected. No, you don't. There was no voting. There was no selection.
Well,
in a
yeah,
lot of tribalism there. As it was, that person has a gift that can be useful to the village life. So
I guess not
Go
select,
ahead.
recognize maybe be a better term, right? I mean, they were recognized for that gift, right? There you go.
Right.
So,
Yeah, that's just a comment I wanted you to kind of have some thought about.
yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is I actually think maybe, like I say, they're using this Hebrew or this Egyptian language, but they're trying to describe maybe, you know, a Mesoamerican, Native American setting. So the way I'm translating it, of course, is basically from the Egyptian, which is kind of westernized. So I don't really have, I wish I had that's why I kept saying, if I had the plates, it'd be great. So I'm doing my best to say, okay, here's the meaning. And I think I say that in the books, like what I'm trying to do here is get the meaning. I may not have the grammar exactly correct or something like that. And it may not have been, it may have been even more what they call metonic, meaning where a glyph was indicative of a story, perhaps, or something. Maybe not, you know, kind of like in Teotihuacan, they have just like a pictograph or something. They're thinking it maybe represents. So in this oral history of religion that Native Americans had, it was just like, okay, that glyph is just a reminder of the story, right? It wasn't like they weren't spelling out every word in the story because it was being told.
I love that reference of a storyteller because that is very foundational with the Native American things, as well as being able to, the person that spoke up wasn't necessarily the leader, as it could be a historian, if you will, or a storyteller,
Right.
or even a person that would have a sense of prophecy. Well, go ahead, Jerry.
No, I'm just saying, I think you're right. And that's why I would hope other eyes look at what I've done and kind of look at it in context. I'm just kind of a boring engineer, right? I don't know. I'm not necessarily culturally versed in everything. I try to read a lot and try to understand mostly Mesoamerica. It's not that I don't know, you know, Native American traditions from up north. You know, I live in Utah and I've done things on the reservations and, you know, work on the reservation. But I would be the first to say, I don't. It comes from this codex. This book is coming from the Native American group, right? And in the Native American context. So a lot of the meaning I may not be able to figure out because I don't have that background.
Yep. Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, Paul, and then Rick. Go ahead, Paul.
Wow, again, I really do appreciate the exchange between Rainbow Eagle and you, Jerry. This is a marvelous demonstration of the benefit of the forum. You see people being able to enrich each other with their vantage points. I wanted to ask you one more question, with which I've been struggling for years, and that is, what do you think identifies the beginning of the Mesoamerican calendar at 3113 BC?
Well, that's kind of interesting. Actually, in my book, one of the things that you have, and I'll maybe talk about that next week, because one of the calendrical markers is called the ISIG. It's like, it's before you have a date in the Maya, you have this glyph, and they haven't really kind of totally figured it out. But it actually has Egyptian elements to it. And, you know, the base date actually for the long count is pretty close to the start of the first dynasty in Egypt. So it may, and some of the that may correlate. I'm not saying for sure it does, but that's certainly an interesting parallel, right? I mean, they obviously, how they calculated that back, I mean, why they did it, nobody really knows at this point. I'm saying that's at least a proposal that would work with the base date, 3,113, whatever, I can't remember off the top of my head, the base date of the long count, BC. So
113, and yeah, I have wondered about it because that's about when you have the beginning of writing. You have any number of significant cultural adjustments that come along about then with both Sumer and Egypt. And
I see, that's, I think, the big mistake a lot of people are making with the Book of Mormon is they're saying, okay, this is this Hebrew culture and it's all Hebrew and it's all the way through an Egyptian. It's like, no, they actually were a small group that got put into a larger cultural context, and were there 1,000 years. So people say, oh, we're going to find, the source of Maya was Egyptian, or the Maya language, or the source of, of it's like, no, they were developing a lot of their own things. Now they may have like the calendar things. I think maybe they said there was some trade going on. I mean, I don't think the only people that made it there was Book of Mormon people. I think maybe you had Phoenicians jumping over there occasionally, time to time. We have a Roman head from 100 AD that was found, in Mesoamerica. So I do think there was a little bit of borrowing, meaning they were constructing a calendar and certain things made sense, and so they put them in the calendar. Maybe even a little bit of the numbers. It's clearly, I think, the Nephite number system ended up being influenced by its surrounding cultures. I mean, not from the God standpoint, they protected that very closely. I mean, they weren't adopting wholesale these pagan calendars, but in the structure of how they wrote their calendar, that kind of thing. They obviously, the day-to-day Nephites were aware of the long count. They were aware of these other calendars. That's what I'm saying. But the Nephite calendar we're looking at is it's in the religious codex. It's in the sacred religious plates. So this was a very protected calendar set, in my opinion. They weren't wanting to corrupt it with the Maya pagan, the 270-day calendar where they have all those pagan festivals every 20 days, to different gods. They were not wanting to do that. They were not wanting to integrate and mix with that. They were trying to keep it pure. And that's probably why they weren't, they were always having problems with their own polity, right? Meaning there was all this other influence. They were always a minority, meaning there's no way an Ammoniah, Alma, and Amulek are going to get thrown in prison if they were the majority, meaning they were, and, he goes from chief judge and then they didn't care about that. Okay, you're not chief judge anymore. We'll just chuck you in prison. So that wasn't this widespread. Their belief system was not this, what I consider very widespread, except for after Christ, the destruction, maybe. I still think you still had all these other existing cultures going, Maya doing their own thing. Obviously they just weren't, I think because of the destruction kind of made it so nobody was like trying to take over other areas or that kind of thing. So you had some kind of isolation a little bit from these other influences from other cultures coming in. But
it's delightful to share with somebody else that contemplates comparable issues that other people think are totally inane.
Well, the Nauvoo House excavation is more important than my translation. Let me put it that way.
House I'm working on. I got the Hans Bill project that I'm trying to finish getting written, and so hopefully I can get a refined copy of that out within another week or so. All right, thank you very much, Jerry. Let's go to Rick and see what he has.
Hey, Rick, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was looking in the Book of Mormon and I searched Egyptian, and it's funny, not really funny, but revealing. You said it was a Hebrew meaning written in Egyptian, when First Nephi 1:1 said they had the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians, which is like almost a parallel statement from what you said.
Mhm.
And then in Mosiah 1:4, he said he taught Egyptian to his sons so that they could read the records, and then they could also teach it to their children, and so on. And then all the way to the end of the book, Mormon 9:32, he's saying we're writing in Reformed Egyptian. But here Mormon has to read all the Egyptian writings all the way back, how many years? You know,
Maybe. I
600
actually have a paper on that I think the small plates were also in Reformed Egyptian. So they lost, they over time, and you can see it in they hit Omni, and these guys, even the supposedly the rights, the ones that are supposed to be the caretakers of these records say we're not even right, we're not even righteous, we're kind of just bad, we're derelict in our duties, and they're very short entries, right? I don't even know how much of Egyptian they even knew at that point. And so, when it says the Mosiah taught Egyptian, meaning there was some knowledge, but it may have been a corrupted form, but he had to use the interpreters, honestly. That's why they were so critical. But I do think that there's at least, what Nephi is writing is in Egyptian, but it's in Egyptian. It's hieratic, Palestinian hieratic. Just like I said, there was actually Egyptian present in Palestine at the time. Now, we don't have a lot of text. It's mostly numbers, a few ciphers, a few, rusted pieces of pots with some markings on them. They had no, that's the interesting thing. The Hebrews had no number system at the time of Lehi's departure. They used the Egyptian hieratic number system. The number system was developed after the exile when they started using it, Hebrew letters for their numbers. That was after. And so they clearly had a knowledge of Egyptian, this clearly the numbers and other things. And also, like they say, the brass plates were likely a good chunk of them in Egyptian. And so in order to read those portions, they had to know Egyptian. Now, probably, the book talking about Jeremiah, because it talked about the writings of Jeremiah being in the brass plates, right? That was just like at Lehi's time. I don't know that that was in Egyptian per se, but some of the brass plates, clearly, if they're the records, and I do think that's what's important. That's one reason why they were so critical that they not be lost, is that they actually had the original text, not these different instructions that some of the later Old Testament scribes did of, rewriting and recompiling. It was actually probably very original Egyptian. But I do think that, so that's a big question, is why did you even get Reformed Egyptian? It's because it did change over time to the point where it was, again, different, substantially different than from what Nephi was writing. And so I kind of think maybe Mormon, when he said Mormon didn't say he could read the Egyptian. He only talked about Reformed Egyptian, and they didn't really even like it. They said we can't even express ourselves very well in it. And it was hard for them to do. It says it's hard for them because it was probably artistic, right? You had to know how to engrave artistically. It wasn't very it's shorthand, but not what they're normally writing. So I do think that probably he had a version. Somebody I'm not saying he did it, but somebody used the interpreter, some earlier prophet or scribe had interpreted the small plates into Reformed Egyptian. That's one of the reasons that proposal answers the question that a lot of critics of the Book of Mormon have proposed, and that is that, hey, Alma said he didn't know whether Christ was going to visit the Nephites in the flesh. That's what he said. It's like, well, how can he say that? It's right in Nephi's writings in the small plates.
Yeah, go back and look it up.
Yeah, but I think, and he obviously knew the scriptures, but I think maybe those plates were not available to him linguistically. They were in the original Egyptian, and by that point in time, he didn't know it. He couldn't necessarily read them, and they were just kind of part of their collection. And then at some point, somebody used the interpreters. It looks like probably they were found at the time. If you kind of look at the Fayette Lapham description of, it talks about maybe when the interpreters were found is when Mosiah was fleeing. Mosiah 1 was fleeing. Maybe that's when the interpreters were found. And so somebody then interpreted the small plates, and then it was known. Also, Simon the Lamanite, he said he knew all that from an angel. Yet he was quoting Zenos and all these other, brass plates people, but it didn't seem like he was familiar with the prophecy that Nephi had.
So somebody could have got the interpreters and then done a reverse lexicon.
Yeah, and at that point in time, they were using Reformed Egyptian, so they just used it. And that's why even if you look closely in the small plate, like Jacob, it said, these are the words of Jacob. There's actually some little prefaces. I think the prefaces were added. They weren't part, Nephi was not writing those prefaces. I think they were added as, again, it was an interpreted from the original Egyptian to Reformed Egyptian, and that was what was in the plate stack. Because the plate stack was not described as having all this separate weird plates, like the small plates were in there. They were all kind of uniform, right? And so you wouldn't
Yeah,
necessarily
standard-
expect that. If,
Standard 8.5 by 11.
right, exactly. So you're saying, okay, maybe that was just, you know, it was done more towards the time of Mormon or something. And it was a, you know, there was a different coloration of, okay, these plates that were small plates were 1,000 years earlier, you know, being a little different color or anything. So,
Yeah.
so it does explain some things that if we are looking at a Reformed Egyptian version in the plate stack, and the original may have been in there too, meaning when you say it took the plates, it had the small plates and then probably the interpretation of them and went together perhaps. So again, I wrote a paper on this, which, you know, made some people mad. I don't care, you know, because they, but yeah, because the other thing is, it's like, what would you not expect the script to have changed, you know, after 1,000 years? Of course you would.
Yeah, that's what I was remarking about Mormon. At the end of the Book of Mormon, he says, and now behold, we have written this record according to our knowledge in the characters which are called among us Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. But
Exactly.
he had to either be able to read those previous records in order to do his compiling, or he had to use interpreters to read those previous records to do his compiling.
Yeah, or somebody else at a meeting. I'm not putting all the onus on Mormons to have done it. Perhaps
Yeah.
Amaron or some of these others. It said, oh yeah, you know, we have interpreters, and you know, it's not talking
Okay.
about the speculation, but I mean, maybe that's why I said he went in, and because it talks about in Words of Mormon, he found these small plates and they were wonderful to him because they had these prophecies on them. I think maybe it was already, when he found them, they were already had a Reformed Egyptian interpretation done of them, so he could just
Yeah.
read them as it was, right?
Yeah,
Does
it's
that make
almost
sense?
like the plates of Jared, ethers plates that were translated, and the translation was sealed up with the original. Is that the way that worked out? He says, I sealed up the plates and I sealed up the translation also.
Yeah, exactly. That's one interpretation that can be made of that verse, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the question, is maybe you had the original plates there and a translation of it.
Yeah. If you can't
So-
read one, maybe you can read the other.
Yeah, and like I said, so you know, these are not questions a lot of people think about.
Yeah.
Obviously, but they
Well-
are actually critical because they, you know, these are things that, you know, put the Mormon in a historical context of what you would
Yeah.
expect linguistically and everything else. So,
Yeah, well, I doubt the Jared's writings were in Egyptian. They were in some, you know, Tower of Babel language.
yeah, and that's interesting. Interesting thing is, like, I do think, like, if you look at the description, like I posted some things from Charles Anthon on my academia, and people got mad. Why are you putting somebody that didn't believe? I said, no, because these are critical. He's describing the glyphs, and he said there were stars, moons, and stuff like that. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, I'm not seeing that in Reformed Egyptian. This is something else, and it may have been the plates, the Jaredite, either the 24 plates, possibly, you know, because they obviously have a different language, or of the original plates of the brother of Jared, right? So there's some indication that there is another language on the plates that is not Reformed Egyptian, and maybe it was just the top. And the reason that he copied that portion for the Anthon transcript, maybe it was the top of the sealed portion that had like an emblem on it, because it was sealed with an emblem and then had some other writing on it, which he would have been able to copy, but you know, he couldn't open the sealed portion, but he could probably see the front piece.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't see anyone else, and thank you for your answers. Great discussion.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Most people just go glassy-eyed, you know.
I am glassy-eyed, but I have to be glassy-eyed to see.
Right.
Well, I appreciate the discussion too, but the fact,
Just a final statement. That's one thing, is I had somebody, again, just mocking me, say, oh, so if I read this translation, you know, did you have a burning in your bosom? Do I get a burning in my bosom when I read it? And I said, no, when you read my stuff, you're gonna get a burning of your eyes. So,
Well, we hopefully will get a chance to get a burning in our eyes again next week.
okay. Well, at least if you sign up, you know what you're getting in for next week. So
I anticipate I'll be back. I hope to be back anyway, but I do need to sign off and take care of my sweetheart. So let me sing us off and we'll see you again next week. Good
Okay.
night. The Lord is watching o'er you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you. Good night, everyone.
Good night,
Paul. Tell
everybody.
Rena hi.
All right.